March 15th, 44 BC went down in history as the day Julius Caesar was assassinated. The conspiracy and the brutal murder in the Roman Senate are well known, but have you ever wondered what happened with his body? Surely a figure as monumental as Julius Caesar, arguably the most important Roman of all time, must have had a grand tomb, right? Well, let's dig into this and find out. Ancient historians like Plutarch, Appian, Cassius Dio and Suetonius left us detailed accounts of the events surrounding Caesar's assassination and what followed. Moments after Caesar fell, the conspirators rushed out of the Curia of Pompey, the building where the Senate meeting was held and where the attack took place, brandishing their bloodied weapons, hands and clothing in triumph. Many who had failed to strike him themselves eagerly ran over to dip their hands in his blood, wanting to be seen as part of the act. As they crossed the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, they gathered a growing crowd of followers. Escorted by armed gladiators, the conspirators marched to the Capitoline Hill, where they barricaded themselves. Meanwhile, the news of Caesar's death spread like wildfire, plunging the city into panic. A terrifying rumor took hold that a group of senators and gladiators had gone mad and were slaughtering people at random. And in the midst of all this chaos, Caesar's body remained where it had fallen, in a pool of blood at the base of the statue of Pompey the Great. It was a bitter irony. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and later his rival, had been defeated by Caesar in 48 BC. Fleeing to Egypt, Pompey was assassinated there, and now his statue silently bore witness to Caesar's own brutal end. Several hours passed before Caesar's body was finally retrieved. 3 servants carried him through the streets of Rome to his home on the Via Sacra in the Forum, the Domus Publica. It was the official residence of the Pontifex Maximus, a title he held at the time of his death. There, a physician named Antistius, possibly Caesar's personal doctor, examined the dictator's remains. According to his autopsy report, perhaps the first recorded application of medical knowledge in a homicide investigation, only one of the 23 stab wounds had been fatal. His findings were later recorded by Suetonius, who wrote, "Of so many wounds, none turned out to be mortal, in the opinion of the physician Antistius, except the second one, in the breast." The location of this wound suggests it may have punctured Caesar's heart, though another possibility is that it perforated a lung, causing it to collapse and fill with blood. A third theory is that it severed a major artery. Whatever the exact injury, the ultimate cause of death was extreme blood loss, but it wasn't instantaneous. Antistius also noted that most of the wounds were concentrated in 2 areas, Caesar's face and groin. The message behind this was clear: emasculation. The conspirators didn't just want to kill Caesar, they wanted to symbolically destroy his power, his dignity, and his very image. For the funeral ceremony, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, and her servants prepared his body according to Roman tradition. By the late Republic, cremation was the preferred funerary practice, while embalming and inhumation were seen as foreign customs. Following standard procedure, Caesar's body was washed and anointed with perfumed oils. Most historians agree that Julius Caesar's funeral took place on March 20th, 44 BC, 5 days after his assassination. His body was to be carried in a grand procession from the Domus Publica to the Campus Martius. At the time, Rome was enclosed by a sacred boundary known as the Pomerium, within which burials and cremations were strictly forbidden. So, just beyond this limit, near the tomb of Julia, Caesar's daughter, preparations have been made for his cremation. Caesar's body was laid on an ivory couch, draped in gold and purple cloth. His pallbearers, a group of magistrates and former magistrates, carried him from the house feet first. This was done in accordance with an ancient superstition. If the dead was carried out feet first, their spirit would leave the home and not return to haunt the living. Out on the Via Sacra, the funeral procession was led by Lucius Calpurnius Piso, Caesar's father-in-law. Behind him came the bier bearing Caesar's body, followed by Calpurnia, his grieving widow. Next were the professional mourners, wailing and weeping. Finally came the singers, chanting funeral dirges. This must have been quite a spectacle for all the Roman citizens lining the streets. But before reaching the Campus Martius, the procession was set to make a crucial stop, the Forum Romanum. There, at the Rostra, the platform from which public speeches were delivered, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted friend and fellow consul, had planned for his speech and a display that would forever change the course of history. As Caesar's funeral procession entered the Forum, it was met by an enormous crowd that filled the entire square. The air was thick with grief. Moans and wails rose from the masses, creating a deafening, almost unbearable sound. According to the Greek historian Appian of Alexandria, the crowd wasn't just made up of mourners. A significant number of armed men, including retired legionaries, had gathered as well, positioning themselves around the rostra to guard Caesar's body. With solemn reverence, the pallbearers carried the bier up the rear steps of the rostra and placed it upon the platform. Beside it stood a wax effigy of Caesar, mounted on a mechanical device that allowed it to rotate. This figure, modeled according to Antistius' autopsy report, bore 23 gaping wounds, each mark a reminder of where the assassin's daggers had struck. Nearby, on full display, lay the blood-stained and tattered garments Caesar had worn on the Ides of March. The atmosphere grew even more volatile. The crowd, already seething with sorrow and rage, was teetering on the edge of eruption. The stage was set, the powder keg was ready, it only needed a spark. Finally, Mark Antony ascended the steps of the rostra. Standing beside Caesar's body, he prepared to deliver what would become one of the most consequential speeches in Roman history. Both Appian and Suetonius recount what happened next. Before speaking, Antony had a herald read aloud a decree passed by the Senate shortly before Caesar's assassination, a decree that had officially declared him divine. Then, with deliberate timing, Antony instructed the herald to recite the oath that he and every senator had taken. By this oath, they had sworn to protect Caesar from harm, and any man who failed to uphold this vow would be cursed for eternity. When the herald finished, Antony addressed the crowd, drawing their attention to key passages in the decree, where the Senate had called Caesar their leader, benefactor, and father of the country. Then, with measured outrage, he contrasted these honors with the brutal reality of what had happened on the Ides of March. The hypocrisy was laid bare. The implication was clear. Those who had once praised Caesar now bore the stain of his blood. Then Antony delivered the final blow. He lifted the torn, blood-soaked Caesar's toga he had worn on the day of his murder, holding it high for all to see. The Forum erupted into chaos. The mourners became a mob. Grief turned to fury. Shouts of vengeance rang through the air, fists clenched and raised in rage. The crowd demanded retribution. Caesar's killers had to pay with their lives. Sensing the rising danger, the senators who had lingered quickly slipped away, vanishing in the city's labyrinthian streets. But the mob was only just beginning. With raw emotion driving them, they stormed the rostra, pushing aside the guards and seizing Caesar's bier. Carrying his body, they surged westward up the Via Sacra, their destination clear, the Capitoline Hill. It is believed they intended to cremate Caesar on Rome's most sacred ground, but when they reached the summit, priests blocked their way. They turned back, moving like a raging tide down the Via Sacra until they reached an open space in front of the Regia, between the Basilica Aemilia and the Temple of Castor and Pollux. The crowd then raided the surrounding buildings and temples, looking for anything that would burn: benches, tables, chairs, furniture. With these they built a massive funeral pyre. When all was ready, they placed Caesar's bier atop the heap and set it ablaze. Mourners began casting personal items onto the pyre: jewelry, clothing, even military decorations, fueling the flames. Ancient historians describe it as an inferno so intense that it soon went out of control, scorching nearby buildings in the Forum. When the fire finally reduced Caesar's body to ashes, the mob's anger remained unquenched. Torches in hand, they surged through the streets, bent on vengeance. Their target, the homes of Caesar's assassins. They hoped to burn them to the ground, ideally with the murderers still inside. But their enemies had anticipated the danger. By the time the mob reached their homes, most of the senators had already barricaded themselves behind locked doors. Though the rioters managed to set a few fires, their attempts to exact justice in flames ultimately failed. As the night fell, many of the conspirators slipped away under the cover of darkness, taking their families with them. Some fled to the countryside, seeking refuge in the estates of allies. Others soon left Italy altogether, escaping to the provincial positions they had been granted by none other than the men they had just slain. As the sun rose over Rome the morning after the funeral, at the eastern end of the Forum's main square, the flames of Caesar's cremation pyre had finally died out. What became of Caesar's ashes remains uncertain. According to the historian Cassius Dio, writing over 250 years later, his burnt bones were collected and placed in the tomb of his daughter Julia at the Campus Martius, as originally intended. But no contemporary sources confirm this, leaving the truth shrouded in mystery. The tomb of Julia itself has never been found. Over centuries, the Campus Martius was rebuilt and repurposed, its original structures buried beneath layers of history. If Caesar's remains were interred there, they are likely lost forever. Still, some believe the tomb once stood near what is now Piazza Colonna. So the next time you gaze up at the column of Marcus Aurelius, consider this. Beneath your feet, hidden deep below modern city, may rest the ashes of Rome's most legendary ruler. But there is another possibility. In the wake of Caesar's funeral, his loyal supporters erected two monuments at the site of his cremation. One was a 6-meter-tall column of Numidian marble, inscribed with the words, "To the father of his country." Beside the column stood an altar, which soon became a focal point of public mourning and even cult-like worship. This did not sit well with Caesar's enemies. Though many of the assassins had fled Rome, the Senate still harbored a strong faction opposed to Caesar's legacy. Determined to suppress his growing veneration, they ordered the removal of both the column and the altar. But instead of quelling unrest, their actions reignited fury among the people. Outraged Roman citizens, joined by veterans of Caesar's legions, rose up once more, demanding the monuments be restored. The shifting political tides of Rome soon led to the formation of the Second Triumvirate in 42 BC, composed of Mark Antony, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. Seizing upon the public's anger over the desecration of Caesar's memorial, they maneuvered the Senate into officially deifying him. Thus, Julius Caesar became the first Roman ruler to be declared a god. They also pressured the Senate to authorize a temple to be built for the divine Caesar on the site of his cremation. However, the construction of this temple would have to wait, as the leadership of Rome was decided in a civil war. Octavius systematically eliminated his rivals. In 36 BC, he exiled Lepidus. In 31 BC, he crushed the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Now, the undisputed ruler of Rome, Octavius, soon to be known as Augustus, completed the Temple of Divus Julius, which he officially inaugurated on August 18, 29 BC. The Temple of Divus Julius was constructed at the far eastern end of the Forum's main square, surrounded by the Regia, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, and the Basilica Aemilia. However, the tight space posed a significant challenge for the temple's architects. With little room to expand outward, they built upward instead. Despite its relatively small footprint, measuring roughly 27 meters wide and 30 meters long, the temple was elevated on a podium, rising between 3.5 and 5.5 meters high. Part of the podium served as a speaker's rostrum, allowing public addresses to be delivered from its commanding height. Above it, the temple itself stood tall, with imposing columns soaring over 12 meters. The result was a striking and dominant structure that loomed over the Forum Romanum. Ancient accounts and depictions on Roman coins suggest that inside the temple stood a colossal statue of Julius Caesar, so immense that it was visible from the Forum's main square whenever the temple doors were opened. One of the temple's most distinctive features was a semicircular niche at the front center of the podium. Most historians believe this niche originally housed the altar that had been erected at the site of Caesar's cremation in 44 BC, before the Senate, fearing cult-like devotion to the fallen dictator, ordered its removal. At some point in the temple's history, the niche was permanently sealed off with blocks of volcanic tuff. The Temple of Divus Julius stood as a lasting testament not only to Julius Caesar's immense popularity, but also to the power of the Julii family, which dominated Roman politics well into the 1st century AD. However, after the fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty following Nero's death in 68 AD, the temple's use, beyond serving as a speaker's rostrum, remains unclear. At one point, the temple was damaged by fire and later rebuilt by Emperor Septimus Severus. It continued to stand largely intact until the 15th century. After that, like many of the ancient buildings in the Forum, it was stripped of its marble and stone to be repurposed for other construction projects. Today, only the foundation of the temple remains, with the supporting cement and brick walls still visible. In front of the structure lies a large rectangular platform, once the lower podium that was the base for the temple's rostrum. At the center of this platform sits the semicircular niche from the 29 BC temple, now sheltered beneath a modern roof. If you venture under the roof, you can still see a few fragments of the ancient tuff wall that once enclosed the niche. Behind it, there are the remnants of Caesar's altar. Most historians agree that in 29 BC, Augustus and the Roman Senate installed an altar in the temple's niche, and this altar is believed to be the same one that had been removed from the Forum in 44 BC. But is this unrecognizable stack of grey stones we see today that very altar? It's quite possible, though not certain. It's also worth considering that Caesar's ashes, or some ashes from his pyre, may have been interred within the altar. Yes, the law forbade the burial of the dead inside the pomerium, but it also forbade their cremation. Yet sometimes things just happen. Also, during his life, Julius Caesar received in advance the right to a tomb inside the pomerium. Today, the Temple of Divus Julius is often referred to as Caesar's tomb, but there is no direct evidence to confirm this claim. Regardless, as the site of Caesar's funeral pyre, the altar remains a place of reverence where visitors continue to leave flowers, coins, and other offerings in honor of his legacy. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. See you next time!